Hey guys, so the meta is continuing to evolve post-balance, so as something I've done in the last few months is really go through some of the top decks and breaking down the cost in a little bit more detail to help you make informed decisions on the next deck to purchase. And so by new contenders, I'm more so talking about decks that I have not covered in the past in terms of these cost breakdowns and not necessarily like new product or anything, and I'll get to that in a little bit more detail. So big thanks to my sponsors as usual, links and discount codes in the description below, and also a big shout out to some of these amazing resources that I always use in terms of getting an understanding of the meta, but also understanding some of the topping deck list. And also big shout out to these individuals as well in terms of really keeping track of all the regional tops, which I use in a lot of my videos, so I'll link everything down below. So now in terms of the cost breakdown, as I mentioned just a few seconds ago, I'm not going to be covering some of the well-known top decks, right, like Kashira, Branded, Labyrinth, whatever, just because I have done cost breakdowns of these videos before, and you can certainly check out those previous videos if you're interested in these decks. Now I get it, some of the costs might have updated since the last time I actually did those videos, but for the most part, a lot of the prices are probably actually the same, except for maybe like MathMech. So let's just start with Vanquish Soul, which of course is a new deck that sort of came out in Wild Survivors, and now when it first came out in terms of its rarity distribution, it got a lot of flack because, people expected it to be a very expensive like tier 2 deck, but I think it's really shown that it actually is a worthy tier 1 contender. In terms of regional tops, it had the 5th most regional top 8 so far in this new format, on Dueling Book, 2nd most played with a 56% match win percentage, really nothing to scoff at, and has shown to be very successful. It's got a pretty interesting end board to say the least, and with those guys like tagging themselves out, and a lot of typical cards that you would sell, let's say like Evenly or Dark Ruler No More, ends up being not so great against this matchup for the most part. So in terms of deck list, so Milano, aka Milano the Duelist, finished 2nd place at a competitive Toronto Regionals. It's an event that I was at personally, and so definitely make sure to check out his channel, by the way, for funny skits. So this was his list, and of course, it's not that surprising. It is a pretty expensive deck. I mean, overall cost being like 570. To be honest with you, from the times that I've done these deck cost breakdowns, again, which I actually use TCG Player, and I actually go through card by card all of the prices just to be as accurate as possible. And so typically a lot of the tier 1 meta decks ends up being around like 500, 550 when you just add up everything. Of course, there are certain exceptions, right? Like for example, Kashira, like that got into really expensive, like $1,000 range. Even Pearly initially was very expensive as well. So it's not too surprising. The problem with this deck though is that if you look at sort of the quote-unquote deck core, which again, it's pretty subjective what you consider as a deck core, I'm purely looking at, just not including cards that are considered as staples for that you might have otherwise already. So the core for this is $300, which is definitely on the higher end from the times that I've done these analysis. Like for example, to give some context, let's say something like Branded, which has a very high engine count, that deck core is also around $300. Same thing with like Dragon Link, even Pearly when it first came out, well, not really first came out, but when it was first a tier 1 contender for like 3 weeks, that was also in the 300 range, so it can get pretty expensive. So it's not too far off, but at least in terms of buying recommendations, I would say it's not the most cost effective one. So unless you really like how this deck fares, perhaps it's better to just go with something like, let's say, Kashira, which would have a cheaper deck core. Next, we're going to cover Floowandereeze, which has been actually doing quite well, especially with this new format. So in terms of regional tops, 8th most regional top 8s, played pretty decently on Dueling Book as well, and always has like a high win percentage. And the deck, while it did lose Barrier Statue, it can still benefit from the fact that it can play really well under Shifter, which kind of kills a lot of decks right now, excluding Kashira of course, and also something like Gimmick Puppet Lock or let's say Ibli Lock. It just does not matter for Flunder because they're just normal summon reliant. And so in terms of deck list, this is the list that Hanko Chow finished 1st place at Niagara Regionals, and I actually did a deck profile on this, and it's on my channel that you can check out. And Hanko is someone who's been playing Thunder for quite some time, has had a lot of regional success with this deck, and really shows that even now it can do quite well. And the deck has been known to be not too expensive for the most part. I mean, for example, as he mentions in the deck profile video, the extra deck is essentially like irrelevant. It could just be anything. So that $138 that you see here with the extra deck, you could just scrap that and just pick whatever the cheapest things you could possibly pick. Side deck, of course, is usually pretty cheap, and you can always change things around. And so in terms of Flunder, the prosperity is really what's driving like the main deck cost. So if you sort of look at the quote-unquote deck core, it's only about $61 USD. And yes, I included Harpy's Feather Storm as a core. I'm sure some of you might joke that Shifter is also a deck core. But anyways, I think Advent is really, in terms of the deck core, the only thing that's kind of notable. I think it's around like $14-ish per copy. So, you know, if you're willing to, if you want to have a cost-efficient strategy, something along the lines of like Sword Soul, for example, or Math Bag, this is another contender for you. And also a deck that can play Shifter, which might be able to just absolutely crap on most other decks right now. Next, we're going to cover Tearlaments, which I feel like is not getting enough respect as it deserves. It is actually quite good right now. Regional tops, 7th most played, or rather 7th most regional top 8s so far. On Dueling Book, though, not doing that well, like just under 50% match win percentage, so I'm not really sure what's happening there, but I still think it's a very powerful deck. And for example, this is the list that finished top 32 at French Nats, which was quite a big event, from my understanding, by Gene. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. So it's interesting with this deck because back when this was tier 0, at least at sort of like its tail end part of its tier 0 days. So for example, after that December ban list where all they did was like hit orange, I would say even then it was a pretty cost-efficient deck considering that it was a tier 0 deck. It wasn't like absurdly expensive or anything. Definitely nowhere near the level of Kashtira, for example, when it was first the best deck and tier 1 deck. So you look at this deck and a lot of the cost actually, if you can kind of spot, is actually from Thrust in both the main and the side, and you really don't need to play that. So it's actually not too bad. And so if you look sort of at the quote-unquote deck core, $120, so it's not cheap per se, but if you know how to pilot the deck well, it is you know, a pretty cost-efficient deck still. I mean, the planet is really the only thing that's actually worth that much, and I didn't include the DPE package here, but you probably should realistically to play it optimally, just as Gene did, as well as other tier lists are doing, but that's certainly an option for you. And then next we have Rikka, which unfortunately is not really played that much on Dueling Book, but in terms of IRL play, it's actually doing pretty well still. Tied for 9th in terms of regional top 8s, and even on Dueling Book, despite the fact that not many players are running it, if they do, they're actually doing really well, just under 60%, which is like how I view as kind of like almost like elite level. So it's a really strong deck. It's a combo-oriented strategy. It's kind of a hard deck to pilot though, but you know what, it's got some interesting lines, and it can really crap on decks that are like normal summon reliant, because this deck can just get rid of bodies pretty easily. In terms of Con, the field spell is pretty busted, just tributing your opponent's monsters. The problem with this deck though is kind of like against the back row matchup, unfortunately. It doesn't really have a in-engine way to deal with that optimally, but nonetheless, if you sort of look at the deck list, this is the one that finished top 8 by Eric at German Nationals. So you know what, $360 for this entire exact deck list, not bad, especially considering that you see 2 thrusts in there, which is rather expensive. The Theory and Regulus is gone down in price a lot ever since Super Heavy Samurai basically died, so it's really not that bad. And if you look at sort of the quote-unquote deck core, which is interesting, if you look at the extra deck, it's all 15 cards, so it doesn't really have you know, like flex, just generic staple extra deck monsters that it's playing, at least in a lot of the lists up top. And so you know what, $93 for this deck core is pretty solid. As I mentioned, it is a bit of a harder deck to pilot optimally though, and so you know, in terms of cost efficiency, it's definitely there, but whether you know you can play it well enough to warrant buying it, that's up to you. And the last deck we're going to cover is Mannadium, or Mannadium, I don't know how to pronounce it. So on Dueling Book, it's actually not seeing that much play, although 54% match win percentage is actually pretty solid. Regional top wise, it's also not that amazing, 14th most regional top 8 so far in this new format. So realistically, I probably could have even put Sky Shark on the spot, but I really wanted to cover a new deck as part of this analysis, so that's why. And so if we look at this deck list by Max, who finished top 4 at Toronto Regionals, and this is actually a deck profile I did on my channel that you can check out. A big congrats, Max. Really sweet kid. So total deck cost for this exact list was about $540. So as mentioned earlier, kind of in line with a lot of tier 1 decks that we see normally, but it is still a pretty expensive deck in terms of the deck core. And so you know, in terms of its end board, you know, like you have the Barone, you have like Appaloosa. I thought they played Chaos Angel too, maybe Max just didn't play it, but that's also a pretty hefty card as well. So you know, combo oriented strategy, originally it was just like a shittier version of what Super Heavy Samurai was doing, like in the 3 weeks that they were tier 1, but now they're gone, so this is like the better version. It's similar to Super Heavy Samurai, it can definitely be be weak to Droll because it does search quite a lot. But you know what, interesting strategy, a lot of like triggers based on like destruction, for example, and just, you know what, the lore is also nice, which is always a little bonus points. Anyways. So in terms of the deck core, $235, so as I mentioned, it's not that cheap. The Visa, Starfrost, as well as the planets, I believe, are like around 25 a copy. Extra deck, I didn't put any of like the synchros in here technically, because they're like Barone, for example. Those are staples. Same with Chaos Angel. But nonetheless, like you really do need them to actually play this deck. Probably the whole point of this strategy is to really like turbo out your synchros and also like Appaloosa as well on top of that. So it's not going to be a cheap deck to play, but you know what? As I mentioned, with let's say for example Vanquish Soul, if you just really like the strategy, then definitely go for it. I mean, no one's stopping you, but if you're looking for more of a cost efficient perspective, this unfortunately would not be in that category. Well, so that was it for the video. Hopefully that was interesting, and hopefully it was helpful in choosing a new deck for you to build in real life play, especially with Nats coming around the corner as you're getting prepared. So big thanks to all of you for watching. A big thanks to my Patreons for the support as always, and a particular thanks to my newest Patreon, Louise. Really appreciate it and really makes my day. So well, take care guys.